Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My two guests today are Branson Parler and Jeff Fisher. Branson is Director of Theological Education, Professor of Theology at the Foundry, and Jeff is also Professor of Theology and Director of Spiritual Formation at the Foundry. Both of them are former professors at Kuiper College. Both have PhDs, one in theology, the other in Jeff's PhDs in historical theology. And I've known Branson for years now. He's part of our collaborative team at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. And I've just briefly met Jeff in passing many years ago and had a wonderful conversation with both of them. The Foundry is a sort of innovative church-based way of doing theological education. The mission of the Foundry is to strengthen and support church leaders at every level with biblical and practical training. I remember when Branson said he was starting the Foundry, and I was really intrigued. So I wanted to have them both on to talk about what it is, because I do think that there's going to be an ongoing need in the church for innovative forms of theological education. Not, as we say in the podcast, not to replace traditional college or seminary. I'm a huge fan of seminary, but to come alongside traditional forms of theological education to reach more people with biblical training. So please welcome to the show for the first time, Jeff Fisher and Branson Parler. All right, hey friends, I'm here with Branson and Jeff, who are co-leaders of the Foundry. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. I should have checked with you before I said that. Is that how you introduce yourselves, or
yes?
Who's the boss
sort
here?
Of. That's one of the fun things about what we do is there's not this template for it, and in some ways we're trying to think outside the box a little bit. But I think the two of us, along with our colleague Sarah Beam, are together. Functioning in different ways. Each of us has different areas that we're helping to lead and guide in, but really working as a team. Valuing team ministry as being a big part of what we do.
That's awesome. And you guys used to teach at Kuiper College, is that all right?
Yeah.
Branson, you and I met. I think I told you this story. I was speaking. I think it was at Faith Dyer, actually, out in Indiana.
Yeah, I think so.
And this was like the first time I've been there several times. And the first time, after somebody heard me speak on sexuality, they came up and said, "Oh, so you must be good friends with Branson Parler." And I'm like, "What?" I don't know who that is. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you guys got to get to know each other. Everything you're saying is like everything he says, you know." So somehow we got in touch and then ended up hanging out. And gosh, it's been a great relationship. I wish we could hang out more, but Grand Rapids is pretty far from Boise. But
that's right, not too close.
You're real quick. Tell people about your academic journey, and then we'll get to Jeff. What led you into Christian academics? What was the heart behind that, and how do you reflect on where God's taking you there?
Yeah. For me, it was always I've loved the academic journey. I had so many questions about my faith that, in a lot of ways, for me, that was what doing graduate work, my master's and PhD, was really wrestling with my own questions about God, about the church, about who we're called to be, but always wanted to use my gifts to serve the church. I love the academic side of things, but grew up in the church, pastor's kid, and again, seeing the good, bad, and ugly of the church, but believe that God has called me to use my gifts to serve the church. And so I think for me, that was one of the reasons why I connected well with the people in the Bible and theology department at Kuiper College, which was formerly Reformed Bible College. So being a Bible college had that strong kind of Bible missions, ministry emphasis historically. And so that sense of wanting to dig into the academic side of things, but not just as its own pursuit, but for the sake of serving and equipping and building up the church.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where it's kind of a natural fit as I see how God has led us to form the Foundry. Very much resonates with that sense of just always being driven by the question, how are we serving the church? How are we equipping, building up, supporting, and strengthening church leaders with the gifts and abilities that God has given us?
We connected because of our common interest in sexuality, and we take an almost identical approach to various questions there. But I was pleasantly shocked to hear that. I mean, you did your PhD on John Howard Yoder, right? And
right.
would be, we would both be probably one of the 5 people on earth that would come at the kind of nonviolence question from a more reform perspective. Would that?
Yeah.
When I heard that, I was like, wait a minute, I thought I was the only one.
Yeah, that's right. It's not, engaging Yoder and looking at Christological pacifism, thinking about it through that lens, and studying that in a reformed context where a lot of times you have, in some ways, kind of caricatures of the Anabaptist or
Right.
Mennonite perspective. I think it was challenging but good, because I think in a lot of ways they're trying to forge connections and maybe help people see things a little bit differently than maybe the standard framework. But yeah, it's a strange mix, the Calvinists and pacifism and putting all those things together. You don't find too many people in that boat.
Yeah, to me it made I think you're more you're actually reformed, right? I dabble. Or at least I would say that's kind of my general theological frame. And even reform, I don't know if I would if that's the tradition I come out of, but for me it's just a very high view of the power of the cross, which is the essence of suffering and as a means of defeating evil. But it's I guess my reformed would be more Bardian-ish, without a lot of I don't know. Anyway, we're getting off track here.
That's right. Well, once you start talking, throwing on the labels out, then figuring out what exactly that all means and where you fit in the taxonomy of things can get a little tricky, because everybody has their ideas of what they think that means.
The labels are just, especially today, labels. I try to avoid them at all costs now. People even say, "Are you a Christian?" I'm like, "Well, what do you mean by Christian?"
Right. Yeah.
Jeff, give us a background of who you are. Have we met? I think did we meet in passing once, or?
I think we met at an ETS conference.
Okay.
I mean, it's probably got to be 6 or 8 years ago now.
Okay.
So
yeah. Cool. How'd you get into theological education?
Yeah, my journey into theological education is a bit different. I actually have a Bachelor of Science in mathematics, so I had no intention of doing ministry or going into theology when I went to undergraduate. But in kind of my sophomore, junior year of college, really sensed God calling me into ministry. And so I did an MDiv at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and then served as a pastor for a little over 5 years in a tiny little town in Minnesota. And so that really, shaped my love for the church and for the people in the church to grow. My title was actually pastor of teaching and spiritual formation. And so that's been one of the passions I've had, is helping people grow in their faith, in their spiritual life and everything. And then while I was there, really sensed that, similar to Branson, I got a lot more questions that were not answered when I was doing my master's in seminary. And I have a lot more questions now that I've been serving the church and had these real experiences and real controversies, challenges. And felt that time at the church wrapping up. And we actually moved to Kathmandu, Nepal for about half a year to teach at a seminary there. Both my wife and I taught there. And then while I was there, I got accepted back to Trinity, back to TEDS, to do my PhD. And my PhD is on Johannes Ecolampadius, a reformer from the 16th century. I did it on the book of Hebrews. So that's historical theology is kind of the field I wanted to do academically, to somewhat parallel what I wanted to do ministry-wise with spiritual formation.
Okay.
And so then this job at Kuiper opened up, and I applied to several jobs. And as you know, in that field, and especially at that time and currently today, there's not very many that are out there, and everyone's fighting for the few of them. And thankfully, the Lord brought me to Kuiper, where I got to teach in a variety of contexts, including church history and spiritual formation and Bible and theology. And I actually loved that piece of a breadth of different topics, different matters, and not just one focus. But then, the last 4 years at Kuiper, I also served as academic dean. So I was teaching theology and doing academic dean administrative accreditation work. And really was feeling this, I need to do more back in ministry. And so through a lot of conversations, a lot of prayer, quite a bit of fasting, we ended up discerning that God was calling us out of Kuiper and the three of us to start this crazy new venture that we call the Foundry.
Wow, what a journey. I really want to get into the Foundry, but I got a few other questions that I got to get off my chest. Are you both part of the CRC? I forget, Branson, if you're CRC or RCA or.
Yeah, so
I'm CRC.
Jeff is CRC,
CRC.
and I'm currently RCA, but right now RCA, as you're probably aware,
that's what I want to get into the butt there.
Is in the process of splintering into a few other groups.
Okay.
And so including our church is in the process of leaving the RCA. And that's been, something that's probably 20 or more years in the making of just churches being on very different pages in terms of theology and ministry. Sort of the presenting symptom is human sexuality, debates about that, but there's, I think, much deeper theological differences at play there too with some of those churches.
So you would say
that's another whole long answer, but so within the reformed communities.
Can you so I it's funny because we do so much work with, we've done a decent amount of work with both CRC and RCI. I keep forgetting that these denominations are pretty small, right? I mean, compared to like
relatively,
UMC or Southern Baptist or something. So for somebody that doesn't really know much about what's been going on, so would it be accurate to describe it? I mean, you said it's kind of a symptom. So the sexuality question of same-sex marriage, it seems like both the CRC and RCA, the majority of members, the majority would be on the traditional side of marriage, it seems, especially in the CRC. But you do have, at the leadership level, I don't want to say 50-50, but there's a decent representative of people who would affirm same-sex marriage and are really trying to make that, trying to basically change the previous stance from both denominations on that question. Is that a simplified way of, or I'm sure there's just like how much you could say publicly, and then there's probably like we could probably have an offline conversation that would.
Yes. Well, I mean that's a fair summary. I mean, for people who don't know, again, being in Grand Rapids, you would think these are like the biggest influential denominations because they are in Grand Rapids.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But and there are other pockets there, but the RCA goes back to actually the 1620s, traces its origin.
Oh, wow.
Oftentimes we'll say they're the oldest Protestant denomination in the U.S.
Wow.
And so you had churches and pastors. This is just a few years after the Synod of Dort, this is rolling, and so. It's historically, ethnically Dutch, but there's a good mix of other folks who are part of that tradition, like me, who didn't grow up in it, but who have become part of it. But I think I would say, that it's an accurate summary that probably the majority of people on the ground in churches would hold to the historic view of marriage and sexuality.
Yeah.
At the leadership level, it might be a little bit different, and part of it is. The struggle in the RCA is there's not a real clean or clear way to address the question in terms of the polity of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically the denomination has said functionally, we're just operating with diversity on this topic, even though technically in terms of statements and other things like that, the historic view of marriage has always been affirmed. There's really no mechanism by which there can be any kind of correction or discipline or bringing churches back on the same page. And so it's sort of like the culture of the church is too far gone, that you have, some churches, especially those out east, New York, New Jersey, where it's actually part of their bylaws that they are affirming of same-sex marriage. And so you just have churches all over the place. And again, underneath that, I think are some deeper differences about understanding of Scripture, authority of Scripture, interpretation of Scripture, even things like the sufficiency of Christ, questions about the gospel. So, the RCA, I would say, is a little bit more all over the place than the CRC is. I don't know if Jeff, if you want to go on the record of
that was my impression that the RCA was just a little bit, and I don't like these categories, but for the sake of simplicity, like a little bit left of the CRC. And again, not that every individual is, but you would have a greater percentage of more progressive Christians in the RCA. Would that be accurate, Jeff? Or
I think so. Yeah. I mean, so the CRC is trying to not have that functional diversity.
Okay.
I don't know how much, if you've seen anything that happened in June, this past June at our synod, at the CRC synod, but it was, most of the votes were 70-30 traditional versus affirming, with the delegates that were there. And, those are representative pastors and elders and deacons. I would anticipate, you're right, Preston, that the people in the pews, the members themselves, it's probably even more traditional than the 70-30 split. But yeah, the CRC is trying to reinforce a position we took almost 50 years ago in 1973 of the historic view, but specifying clearly that the CRC does not view same-sex attraction as sinful, but same-sex behavior as sinful. And so the big move this summer was to talk about what it means to have confessional status, so that what all pastors and elders and deacons agree that they will hold to and teach about and not contradict. And what was decided was that the word unchastity in the Heidelberg Catechism includes same-sex sexual activity, and therefore that is what is confessional. And so anyone who's signing with what we call the Covenant of Office Bearers is saying that is the correct interpretation of the Heidelberg Catechism's answer to that question, that unchastity includes same-sex sexual activity.
Okay. Was that so? Same-sex attraction is not a sin. That
right.
Did that go over well with the I guess the more conservative side? Did you have issues on the other side of people saying, "Oh no, I don't know if I want to agree with that," or?
Yes, I mean, you're right, because one of the fascinating things is, in follow-up to this, one of the questions was, so can someone who's agreeing that this is covenantal or this is a confessional thing, if you're arguing that same-sex attraction is sinful, you are actually not in line with the confessions either, with our interpretation of the confessions. So you kind of have this like ultra-conservative side that is much more like anything same-sex. I mean, it's lust, or however they're going to interpret it, that is sinful. They're equally out of alignment with the official position of the CRC as those who are, same-sex marriage, same-sex activity is, can be fine in a lifelong committed monogamous relationship.
So it sounds like on the RCA side, there's people leaving the denomination for like it's more traditional churches that believe in traditional marriage are believing the RCA, whereas the CRC, it said, no, this is we're holding to the traditional view. So churches that are leaving the CRC, are there churches leaving the CRC to embrace a more affirming view, or?
Not yet, but it does. There has been rumbling about it, that there might be some, especially, so Grand Rapids East is what we call classes, our regional group that is most affirming. And that's what our church is actually in. And our church holds the traditional view. So we find ourselves in kind of this weird, we're in alignment with the denomination, but we're out of alignment with pretty much everybody else, not quite everybody else. A couple other churches are traditional in our denomination, or in our classes. Mm-hmm. So there's only been a couple that have made comments about even checking with the RCA, because even though the RCA is still officially traditional as well, denominationally, they see that it's heading more affirming. And so they're like, well, maybe we can go that direction.
And most, in my experience, probably in your experience too, when it comes to the the educational level, you're going to have typically people in academia are going to lean more left than whatever they're part of. And I don't know much about like Calvin College or seminary. I would assume, I don't know anything about how this is affecting, because Calvin is officially CRC, right? That's
yes. Yeah.
I would assume there's internal tensions there with that. I don't know. What's what can you say publicly about, is there going to be something that's going to come to a head there, or is it just kind of like institutions are always going to wrestle with internal tensions and diversity and people signing statements that they don't actually believe, and I'm not assuming that that's happening.
Yeah, no,
but
I
it
mean,
probably is.
It's a good deduction.
Because it's a Christian school. It probably is happening.
It's a Christian school, and it's a Christian school that's denominationally affiliated. So like Kuiper College, where we were, was not connected to a denomination. But Calvin is the school, the university of the CRC. And there's a few others that are similarly related, but no one has the same kind of relationship as Calvin. And so, yeah, this is definitely, I mean, there's professors that have already left. There were people, they raised a lot of questions at Synod about what does this mean as, with academic freedom? How does that relate to, what I'm actually teaching in the classroom? I don't always agree with what I'm teaching in the classroom, but I want students to understand it and engage with it and everything like that. So, I mean, there's all kinds of questions like that. If you know Kristen Kobes-Dumais, the author of Jesus and John Wayne, she's a Calvin University professor. So she's got a lot of, if you want to find out what's going on at Calvin University, Google Dumais and see what she's put on her blog and stuff. She's explained a lot of the kind of the inner tension that's with it and who's wrestling with what. Interestingly, a lot of the seminary professors have much more emphasized the traditional historic view on sexuality than have been pushing for an affirming view.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well,
and that's a big difference between.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that's a big difference between in the RCA Western Seminary where Jim Brownson taught. There were several others who were very much on the affirming side, so that the majority of the people in the RCA felt like they were pushing against their seminary professors, whereas in the CRC, again, there seems to be more alignment there with people the seminary professors holding to the historic view in a way that aligns with at least probably the majority of the denomination.
And didn't Western just hire, oddly enough, Wes Hill to take over Brownson's post when he retired?
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, they've made a huge turn.
They've made a huge turn. Though they're still, I think they're trying to represent the RCA of like a diversity of views on this topic.
Okay.
So they do have people there who are more affirming and people there who are much more to the historical traditional view.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a long intro to the main point of having you guys on. But I do feel kind of as a closely connected outsider to both the CRC and RCA. Lots of friends who are leaders, and talked to Bob Bauer. I know he's leading one of the biggest churches there, and it's a mess. I mean, I won't say a mess. I mean, it's what a lot of denominations are going through. And even the UMC is going through kind of similar stuff. But anyway, the Foundry. Yeah. So you guys were part of, for lack of better terms, traditional theological education, and you decided to launch out. I'm sure this was a big risk to start this, but what was the heart behind leaving traditional theological education and starting the Foundry? Or how about maybe just describe what the Foundry is? Let's start there and then go back and why you wanted to pursue this.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I think it's actually helpful to do the why part first and then talk a little bit more about what it is that we do, because I think, part of the challenge that we recognized is that higher ed, for a variety of reasons, is less accessible maybe than ever before in terms of cost, in terms of timing. There's so many shifts happening across the cultural landscape, including the church landscape. One of the things that I think Jeff and I continually, I was always in his office being like, how can we figure out how to make what we do more accessible to people? Because we would hear from pastors, church leaders, I wish people in my church could sit in on this class or be part of this or learn in this way. And realizing that, the college or traditional seminary model is, it's this very expensive, highly bundled, highly inaccessible package. And so a big part of our question was, how do you make this much more accessible to churches, for leaders at every level, from volunteers to lay leaders, elders and deacons, Sunday school teachers, youth workers, all the way up to people who are preparing for ministry, and even pastors who already have degrees but are looking for ongoing education. One of the best, I think the metaphor that maybe best captures this is Justo Gonzalez's, he talks about an irrigation hose instead of a pipeline. And so historically, the educational piece is a pipeline where you have a select few people who go all the way through and they get they get all the resources, they get all the training, and you go all the way from the start to the end. And instead, he uses the idea of an irrigation hose that, you lay in your garden and it's got water coming out of it every few feet, so that everything along the way is getting watered and nourished. And so, I mean, this is one of the huge challenges as we talk to pastors and other leaders is, they're like, well, I've had 7, sometimes more plus years of training and equipping in Bible and theology and ministry. And many of my leaders in my church have really zero systematic, hey, we want to train people in just Bible knowledge, theological knowledge. How do you make sure as you're, teaching 5th graders that you're well equipped to talk about who God is, have basic Bible knowledge and things of that nature. And so because of that, it puts this huge stress on a lot of our church systems that you have a, very small number of people who've done any kind of equipping and training. And then most others are like, whatever you can get in Sunday school, in Bible studies, et cetera. And so part of our thinking is how do you make this more accessible all across the way?
Okay.
I don't know, Jeff, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, really what we are interested in doing, and some of the language we use, is supporting and strengthening church leaders at every level. And that irrigation metaphor really helps show that we have, we're trying to use the resources that we've been granted and the training that we have to then help train others so that they can train others. And I mean, we're trying, in some ways, we like talking about this, is we're trying to kind of recapture a biblical model of passing on to other people to pass on, rather than just having these one entities that like everyone has to come there. Because like Branson said, Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 9:30 to 10:30 is not a very accessible time to go learn about the Bible or theology for most people. Mm-hmm. So how do we actually make this stuff accessible to others, not just those who are, have the time or the resources, or it's the point in life that they're doing that kind of study?
I think I know the answer to this, but just to make it clear, like I'm not hearing you saying that like this is designed to like replace traditional seminaries, but to come alongside and offer another way of going about theological education that is accessible to a certain demographic where the traditional seminary might not be accessible. So your pastor, say somebody would love to go to Calvin Seminary or something, but they live in Ohio and they're pastoring a church and they're 55 hours a week or whatever, but they know they would love to get more training, but they can't leave that and come here. And maybe, a lot of seminaries also have online options, but they would still love to have a more in-person model, but based in their actual context. Would that be a accurate way of describing? Okay. So you go what does it look like when you go, like real practically, say there's a church here in Boise listening and they're like, oh, this sounds great, but I'm not exactly sure what this looks like. What would it look like for them to tap into the Foundry?
Yeah. So part of what we do, like you mentioned Bob Bauer and folks at Faith Church Dyer, we've been partnering with them from the beginning. Okay. They had, I think, a great vision for what leadership development looks like in the local church. And so in their case, again, we do a variety of things, but in their case, what we do is a kind of seminary at church model where we set up classes that run in a way that be integrated in people's life and ministry. So we connect there every 2 weeks. Jeff or I actually drive down there. It's about 2.5 hours or so if traffic cooperates. But we go down there and they have folks, from their 5 campuses, and we've talked to some other churches in the area as well who come, they participate in these classes that are set up in a way that I think they're similar to seminary content, but packaged, the way that one of their leadership directors puts it, packaged in more of an adult education model where, we meet for 3 hours every other Thursday night. Okay. There's reading, there's assignments. The assignments are very much focused on ministry outcomes. And so less just writing academic papers, but saying, how are you applying what we're learning right now in your ministry and in your context? And so that's one example, one slice from kind of the leadership development seminary alternative that we're doing.
Now, do you do that with, so that's within driving distance. Say a church in North Carolina wanted to tap in, you would fly somebody out there, or would you find a local person that could teach, or are you at the beginning stages of figuring all that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're at this point. You know, when we think about it, for me, it's much more, how can we be a platform and model that others can participate in? So if a church in Boise called me, I'd probably call you and say, hey, Preston, there's a church here that wants to do, you know, this kind of equipping and training. And you're somebody who has that ability. You're somebody who has the capability to do that. Would you think about doing that? And so as I've talked to other friends, even in other parts of the country, I mean, I'm always kind of have my eye out for semi-recruiting. Like if you're a teacher and you love the church, I guarantee you there are churches in your area who would love to do more learning and being equipped in this way, but have a whole lot of people who just, again, don't fit the typical seminary slice of people who that fits with their life schedule, with their finances and all those pieces.
Do teachers need to have like an academic requirement, like at least a MDiv or a master's degree in theology to teach, or preferably a doctorate, or what does that look like?
We haven't got that far on the policy on the policy end, but I think that would be preferable. I don't know, Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a hard thing here because we're doing theological training to not get degrees necessarily. And so then there's a bit of irony to be like, but in order to teach for us, you have to have a PhD or a D-Min or something.
Okay.
It's much more likely that at this stage, we'd really only be able to recruit or have teach for us people we already know. And so a lot of what we're really emphasizing is competency. And so, I mean, if you don't have an MDiv or a PhD or a D-Min, but you are clearly a competent teacher who knows the scriptures, who knows theology, particularly who's experienced in ministry, then you're the sweet spot of who we're looking for.
Right.
So, yeah, I think theoretically it wouldn't necessarily be required, though a lot of people up to this stage in history who have those kind of desires and competencies end up getting an MDiv or PhD at this point.
So that makes, I mean, it also depends on, I would assume, what the topic is, who's teaching it, and who's taking the class. So like a pastor with an MDiv who wants to go deeper theologically probably isn't going to want to be taught by somebody who doesn't even have that level of a degree, you know? At the same time, a pastor with, say, a master's degree, say an undergrad degree with 40 years of experience and has just handled the spiritual conversation, the spiritual formation piece, and has demonstrated that in his or her life. Like, yeah, they don't need the degree to like qualify them as a leader in spiritual formation necessarily, you know? So that's how I would, I think it's, and I highly value, I think degrees are fantastic. And I always encourage people, if you can, the more the better, you know, but at the same time, you know, lots of people with degrees who aren't actual qualified theologians for various reasons. And you know, the life doesn't match their teaching and so on. So, man, I mean, you mentioned, not to keep bringing it back to Boise, but I know a few amazing teachers here that you can easily tap into. And I think there's a huge need here. There would be, I think sometimes the broader culture here might not recognize the need, but there's a huge need for more theological education, church-based theological education. Yeah. And I imagine that's probably true of a lot of different areas too. Probably there's a smattering of really qualified teachers. There's a need. How do we convince this area that this is necessary? Because it also takes some camaraderie between churches. I think that would be, I mean, if I could speak freely, I think there's a lot of great churches in Boise, and there's attempts to kind of bring people together, but that's most pastors would say it's kind of hard to bring people together. A lot of people are just kind of doing their own thing or whatever. And it's to have kind of a collective kind of like, hey, we as the church in Boise recognize this need. We're going to get behind making something like this happen. Is that something is that an issue you face in other places? Like getting churches across denominations to come together for something like this, or?
Yeah, I think so, because it's, again, as a different model, you know, historically, again, you think about the denominations that we represent, where it's like, well, there's a centralized seminary.
Right.
And so that is that's sort of the collective way that churches, I guess, avail themselves of the theological education. So I think it does take key churches and key leaders in those churches to say, hey, we really value this. And I think to recognize that if churches don't do this and commit to it, it's likely not going to happen. Like the old model of somebody somewhere is just going to decide to go to college and then seminary. I think there are people who are still doing that, but I think there's less of those people, and I think less of them that are actually going into pastoral ministry. And so I think churches at this point, I think we're already a little bit behind, but need to recognize if we as churches don't develop the next leaders, nobody else is developing them. Right. And I think there's that mindset that a lot of times we just assume, again, we pick the kid with the Bible knowledge or something from youth group, and we're like, okay, you go get trained, and then go be a pastor probably somewhere else.
Yeah.
And instead for churches to have, again, kind of a good farm system, to use the baseball analogy, is to have that mindset of it's actually our job to be raising up and equipping the next leaders, even pastors of our church. Again, most churches, I think, would say, well, we don't know how to do that, or maybe especially those last couple stages, we've kind of outsourced that to seminary. But part of our question is, how do you, again, think about this in a different way, different models with teachers, people like Jeff and to say, we actually need to partner with churches to provide the avenues for people to be trained and equipped in that.
Right. So it's not accredited, and that's not like something you guys are even wanting to pursue, right? Is that right?
Well, it's what we're doing is not accredited. The work we're doing with Faith Dyer in their ministry institute, they do have a partnership with the Kairos University some of the students can choose to apply to get credit for some of the coursework that they're doing for us, because we do have syllabus assignments.
Sure.
I mean, we've got all the academic background stuff that you kind of need if that ever happens. And then we've also been in conversation with other seminaries to do something along the lines of a competency-based theological education where they would recognize the work that our students, learners, participants have done, and then grant them certain credits toward one of their degrees. But we ourselves are not, this is my pendulum swing from academic dean, we're not really, don't really have in the plans that we would create our own kind of degree system. They get certificates that come from us when they've completed a series of courses and everything, but nothing accredited by ATS or anyone like that.
Have you guys you should talk to the people down at Denver Seminary. I feel like a lot of institutions, there's so much background and hurdles and this and that. So to get innovative is just, I can only imagine how big of a nightmare it would be, especially when you are accredited and there's like, oh my gosh, the thought of even trying to create some kind of something else is so overwhelming. Denver's one, and I'm sure there's others. I don't want to, but the people at the very top, they're very in tune with kind of cultural shifts and movements, and are really trying to explore, like, what does theological education look like in a post-internet, post-pandemic, post-Trump, post-whatever world that we're living in. It's just, it's very different. The world today is very different than when almost all of our traditional schools were created. And I think, which is fine, but it's like we do have to start to, like, one of the things I asked, Denver and other schools is like, okay, we all know that anybody that steps foot in the ministry is going to be hammered with questions about what, finish my sentence.
Sexuality,
gender, politics.
Half our youth group is, LGBTQ, race. There's riots outside my, the politics. Our church is divided over, abortion. I mean, the list goes on. So it's like, okay, how much of that is built into our curriculum? And it's like, we have an ethics class that's optional, and we spend a couple of weeks on sexuality, and you can write a paper on it if you want. You kind of, that's just my cynical, I know there's sometimes more than that, but I guess it's a long, very long question. Are you guys addressing maybe, or helping to prepare people for some of those really immediate and crucial pastoral needs? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so one of the ways, like the very first class we did at Faith Church Dyer, and we could talk about the broader spectrum of what we do. We keep kind of coming back to that, but the first class that we did was contemporary cultural stories, and so this is where I feel like for us, we looked a little bit at what others were doing. One example of this is the Missional Training Center in Phoenix with Mike Goheen.
Oh, yeah.
And his emphasis on the missiology that, when we think about where we're at in our culture, again, so many people still have the Christendom mindset and doing ministry in a Christendom mindset and shifting to think through how do we engage a culture and even people in our own pews who are very much trained by these stories that are not the Christian story, not the biblical story. And so I think we try to recognize, and that's woven throughout. I'm doing a class on sexuality this year with some folks who are engaging in Grand Rapids and elsewhere. And so I think that sense of we want to be attentive to the ministry questions on the ground first and let that shape the questions that we're asking and even the kind of the outcomes that we're looking for. So it doesn't minimize those other things, but it says, being able to give, the 4 options for how the Hebrew should be translated in this passage is not the most pressing pastoral question that people are going to face. And I love the languages. I love doing that. But again, sometimes we start with these things that are so academic and abstract that we do need to have somebody in our church addressing them in some way. But if we're thinking about what does ministry look like on the ground, how do we start from there to equip people for where our culture's at, where our church is at, what you have to navigate today?
It's such a hard tension for me. Because I still believe, like you said, that languages are super important, and
they are.
To be able to even navigate a good commentary that is dealing with the Hebrew. And if you're preaching through Genesis, you should be able to understand, some of the top commentaries that are looking at this Hebrew phrase and this word or whatever. So I don't want to minimize that. I don't want to minimize having a solid knowledge of the Bible, taking OT Survey 1 and 2 and New Testament backgrounds. You can't understand the New Testament without diving into the background. So as I think through, it's like, as I think through the kind of needs, all I did is recreate the traditional 98 credit hours of a seminary. But then I'm the one, sounding a horn. Well, we need like 3 semesters on sexuality and 2 on gender. And we need, but it's like, well, yeah, you can't do it all. So it's such a hard tension. I don't want to ditch the languages. I don't want to say, just go read the Old Testament on your own. And we're just going to teach on race and politics or whatever. Like, I don't know. Like, what's the answer to this?
Well, I mean, that's where I think the irrigation metaphor is actually really helpful, because there are already institutions who will teach you Hebrew and Greek and do Old Testament survey and all that stuff. That part of the irrigation line is getting water. What we're trying to do is look for where are the gaps in this irrigation line that are not getting water. And a lot of that is like we've said, other leaders in the church. The pastors may know Greek and Hebrew, maybe, if they've kept up with it, but the elders, most of the elders probably don't, and your deacons don't, and other staff members don't. And so, and they may not be able to do some of this, even the theological work that those who've already received a lot of this watering, a lot of this training. And so that's kind of what we're trying. We're not replacing seminaries. We're really trying to water different parts of the field so that there's, a more saturated field.
So you take the needs.
And so,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so this is where, just to briefly mention a couple other things in terms of what we do. So part of what we do is equipping for elders and deacons, other lay leaders. We lead several of these per year that are multi-church workshops, as well as going into churches and doing specific workshops for those churches focused on cultivating leaders or addressing tough topics, going in to talk to them and equip them on matters of sexuality and gender, things of that nature. So trying to provide at that part of the garden, the irrigation stream, making sure that we're providing more opportunities for people to grow. We do ministry formation groups in Grand Rapids that a lot of those are elders or younger, 20s and 30s staff members at churches. Again, people who for different reasons are not going to seminary. That's not really even on the table. but who want to keep learning and growing in community. We're also doing stuff for pastors. And so Jeff leads a once a month a pastors group that focuses primarily on, just soaking in scripture, prayer, spiritual nourishment. And then this year, starting in August, we're going to start a pastors learning cohort on gender and sexuality. So get pastors together once a month to really dig in deeper to say, how do we, as pastors and leaders, equip our churches to do better pastoral care for LGBT plus people and their families. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do is to help churches shift their mindset so that churches see the need and value for churches themselves to be lifelong learning communities. And so I think this is part of the deficiency of kind of the degree system. Is not only is it focused very narrowly on a one part that's getting all the water, but it's also terminal in that it's like, okay, do this, jump through these hoops, get your degree, and you're done.
Mm-hmm.
And most pastors I know are continuing to wanting to learn and grow, and they want people in their churches to do that. But many churches don't really have a mechanism, culture, or a system set up whereby you would see something like that happen. And so I think that's maybe one of the big shifts. Again, it's not to pit sort of practical ministry against the languages or some of those other pieces, but to say, where and how does this fit? I mean, and see, what do people need now? What do people need next as they go along in order to grow?
So you assess, by the way, let me plug your book real quick so it doesn't look like you made me do it. So Branson just finished an incredible book on, sexual ethics, theology of the body. It's kind of like a Protestant version of JP2's Theology of the Body. Is that, I don't know if that's how you want me to pitch it, but it's called Every Body Matters. Is that
Everybody's Story.
Everybody's story. That's what I love about it, that bodies tell a story. Your sexual ethics tell a story. Your marriage tells a story. And that's very much the design, that God is, the thing that God's designed it to do. So when's that come out? Real quick. I'm sorry for the detour, but.
No, that's okay. Yeah, that comes out October 11th.
Oh gosh. Okay.
So couple months away here. Sweet.
Yeah. I wrote the foreword to it very gladly. It's an incredible book. So, so you assess the need. So I'm going to keep mentioning Bob Bauer because he listens to this podcast. So another shout out to Bob Bauer. But for example, like Bob, probably doesn't need a class on preaching. It's a good preacher, like that's probably not the most pressing need. Is I want to be able to preach better. Maybe it is, Bob. I don't know. You can let me know. Maybe taking an Old Testament survey class. He's done that in seminary. He's been reading the Bible for, umpteen years. He's not that old, but, but he might say, yeah, but we have lots of divisions in the church around race, and I need to really get my mind around this. I want my elders to get a handle on, is CRT, the Messiah or the devil, or none of the above. Like, so you assess, or you probably talk with the leaders and say, okay, what are your, to use your metaphor, the dry spots in the ground that need some more irrigation? We don't need to keep watering the green grass. We're going to be fine there. But there's some dry spots here that are really wrecking the whole lawn, if you will. Is that a accurate way of framing it? It's very needs-based, on the ground, needs-based.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's where for us, it's really important that we are in a lot of ways in the trenches with the churches and church leaders that we're working with. Like we want to understand what's going on in their context and be able to provide teaching, training, and equipping that meets those needs, that connects with that, as well as also at certain times being able to say, well, here's a need maybe that we're seeing that you're not necessarily seeing, right? To kind of go back and forth in that kind of partnership and how that works. And yeah, that's exactly right. In terms of pastors, like I mentioned with the pastors learning cohort, that's part of what we want to develop is places where, again, whether it's matters like sexuality or I'm already thinking probably next year, 23, 24, politics, how do you navigate as a pastor? And a big part of what I love about what we get to do is that we're doing this oftentimes together in a way that creates community among leaders of a local church, but also multiple local churches and pastors who are getting together. That I think is extremely valuable to know I'm not alone. I'm not the only pastor who's looking at my Facebook feed thinking, what is going on with people in my congregation? I'm not the only one who it's okay to admit, I don't really know what to do. How do I come alongside this teenager and their family that it's wrestling with gender identity issues? And so to even be in the same room with others who are walking that ministry journey, I think is incredibly helpful. And I think it's a piece that we sometimes leave out of the education, is the actual formation in and for community, like that pastoral ministry. We've kind of cast that as very much a solo, go get trained solo and you'll be part of the staff, but you're also kind of on your own. And so I don't really think I think there's a great deal of connection when pastors do get in the same room because they don't feel alone. But even there, I wonder how can we revision, remodel even how we think about that churches would say, yeah, it's normal. I would want my pastor to be part of this monthly group where they're praying and soaking in the word and where they are learning with other pastors, because that's going to be key for their own life and ministry, sustainability.
Yeah. That's good. Wow. How do we handle I just keep thinking, man, 2016, opened our eyes to people's Facebook feeds and what's really going on in the heart. 2020 put it over the top. 2024 is going to be a bomb. It's going to be,
yes.
I mean, on one sense, as somebody who's pretty much, as an exile living in Babylon, it's going to be a little entertaining on one. I mean, it's going to be like, I'm going to cancel Netflix. I'm just going to turn on the news and get my popcorn. This is going to be like, oh my word, this is going to be, that's a little probably too cynical because people's lives are affected by political movements, but how we got to start doing, how do we prepare church leaders for what's gonna be loads of political divisions in the church, loads of church divisions and divisiveness in 2024? What do we start doing?
Yeah. Jeff, you're the historical theology person.
Preaching the kingdom.
What's worked in the past? Anything?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, obviously, yeah. In the past, there's lots of divisions and changes of leadership and everything. And I mean, I think, the exile versus are we Babylon or are we Israel is kind of one of the key, metaphors to look at this. Because I think a lot of people, particularly, politically right, have viewed America as this nation that is like Israel. We're God's chosen people. And so, of course, we should have the leaders, and of course, we should have all this protection. And, I would say, a lot of that has waned significantly, and we've never been Israel. We've never been the chosen people as the United States. So I think it's kind of recognizing where we are in history and, who we are as part of the Gentiles. And I think the focus now for the church needs to be more on the church and how do we develop as faithful followers of Jesus in community, rather than trying to steer things politically. I mean, of course, I'm going to vote and I'm going to make good choices and everything. But I think Christ's kingdom, and I mean, you mentioned suffering in the cross, like the reality of the cross as what it means to be followers of Jesus has to take priority over our political alliances, our political hopes, our political aspirations.
I have the solution. Somehow convince Christians to turn off the news I think shut it. I mean, not turn off the news, but most of the news outlets, whether it's CNN or Fox, that is playing a huge discipleship role in the church. Huge. I almost sound like Trump there. That was not huge. And there are some better outlets. Let me plug the Pour Over podcast. This is a Christian-based news outlet that gives you, here's what's going on. They're not going to even bend your heart in this direction. They're not even going to say it in a way that's like makes you like Trump or angry at Trump or whatever. I can't believe we're still talking about Trump. I thought he was gone. But he's not. They're not going to mock, Biden's age. They're just going to say, here's the decision that happened. You make your own interpreted. But if we just had a more neutral funnel from which we get to be from which we get informed on what's going on. Because I do think we should be informed. I don't want to put our head in the sand, but the medium of how we get informed is so
huge,
so driven by propaganda and spiritual formation. It's bending our affections in a certain direction, and usually it's turned towards anger and bitterness and outrage towards anybody else who is on the other side of this Babylonian political aisle, which is. Is it a crisis? I think it's a crisis. I've seen so many families divided and churches divided, and not over theology, not over, I think we should do missions better. No, we don't, it's like, wait, you're wearing a mask, who'd you vote for? Right. It's like, oh my word, Satan is just laughing. He's just like, I'm sure he's just like saying, I can't believe how easy this was. I didn't have to open up. I didn't have to like manipulate doctrine or get people to not believe in I just had to like talk about, get them to listen to this outlet or not that outlet, I don't know.
And the whole system is designed to spark that outrage because that's what draws audiences.
Yes.
So, social media, news, everyone is in this like business of getting your attention. And the way to get your attention is to drive this like polarization and outrage. Yeah. And you're right. That's totally forming us and shaping us in ways that are not very healthy and also not very Christ-like.
So how do you convince people to turn it off? Or, have you tried? Have you seen success because some people, it's like they don't realize that this steady drip of this propaganda news outlet is shaping my heart. It's when you step back, it seems so obvious, but like people are in it. It's, can we pry them away from that? How do we do that?
Well, I like your strategy of just saying some of it, just turn it off. If in fact, my pastor 2 weeks ago on Sunday said that. He's like, you all need to turn off the news and just stop taking that in all the time. I think it reveals this discipleship deficit, or maybe it shows like we need to name it for what it is, like that you are being discipled, you are being shaped and formed in a way that I think, again, probably for lack of biblical and theological rootedness, most Christians don't recognize that it's not that this is leading you astray from your calling as Christians. That the way we tell the story, at least for many, I guess both conservative and progressive, ends up tying our faith so closely to the politics of the country that. Again, the church is just eclipsed, right? There's no theology of the people of God as being somehow distinctive, and you wonder what would happen if you were to say, okay, you can, the hours of social media and news that you take in has to be equal to or less than the time you spend face to face with other believers from your local body. And if it doesn't, then you just need to recognize that you are American first and Christian second.
Right.
Like that one of those takes priority over the others. I don't know. That might seem harsh, or people are like, can you really do that?
Yeah.
I think so.
Man, so hard. I love to just play around with scenarios. Like and we're kind of largely post-pandemic, right? Or I don't know. Depends on what state you're living in. But I always wonder, like, what if Trump was like super into masks?
Yeah.
Right.
Like, what would that have done?
I know. I think the same thing. Yeah.
Is it based on like science? Is it based on health? Or is it really it became such a tribalistic identity that if he was super into masks, or people that are like, think like if you don't get vaccinated, you're immoral. I tell people, which is typically that'd be people on the left. You want to get people vaccinated, just start calling it the Trump vaccine. Like, oh yeah, I totally trust. I don't really like Trump, didn't vote for him, but man, he really rammed through this vaccine, and I'm so thankful for him. Like, I took the Trump vaccine. I trust the Trump vaccine. I know that I'm gonna get emails for that, but people are so tribalistically oriented. Now they just don't realize. I think they don't. It's just like it's absorbed. Oh man. Anyway.
That's why I think Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. I know we've talked about that before, but
it's huge.
I think that's so helpful in terms of, even though it's not from an overtly Christian source, I think that's actually a helpful source for pastors to read to have a sense of what's going on with the tribalism in my church. Why is it that, again, people gravitate to whatever political personalities, commentators in a way that, they'll do whatever they say.
Mm-hmm.
Will they listen to their pastor of their local church? Probably not. But they'll connect with this tribe of people because it just reinforces so many different things.
I've been listening to so I do the Pour Over podcast to get just a broad overview, kind of what are the big things, any big things that happen, and then I try to listen to like politically either left of center, right of center, people who just aren't, they're independent thinkers who are engaged in long form conversations around political issues. So they don't do the sound bites. They don't rely on a tribalistic kind of narrative. They're really thinking through things. So like I really like, so left of center, Barry Weiss is fantastic in terms of getting an honest, long form, conversation about Roe v. Wade and the reversal, what that means. And we'll have different voices on. Andrew Sullivan, kind of right of center, is good. Matt Taibbi's good. Coleman Hughes, I don't know where he would be. He's good on the race. Like he'll push on all kinds of different stuff. But these like having hearing like an hour-long perspective from somebody who might be right of center, left of center, but isn't going to just check off all the boxes of some tribe that they're a part of. I found that to be disorienting because it's like, oh, everything is way more complicated than I thought.
Yeah.
CRT, complicated. The Florida law is complicated. The elections, complicated. Every political candidate's very complicated, which at the end of the day, if we can produce more slow, humble thoughtfulness among Christians, obviously in the political arena, but especially in the theological arena, and like the how helpful that would be for discipleship, so that people aren't just clinging to this voice or this slogan or this whatever. They're actually, when they're faced with something, they're like, okay, let me slow down and really think through this, and maybe it might be a while before I really form my opinion on whatever it is that's in front of me. Like I feel like that's not an insignificant aspect of discipleship as a whole. I'm thinking out loud here, so feel free to shoot me down, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and with that though, then part of the question for churches is, where do you, in your regular rhythms of life, create space for those kind of long form conversations, for you to sit down with other people in your church where you're going to process. Again, I think that's what I love so much about the academic world is, hey, we're going to be together for 15 weeks. We're digging deep into this. There aren't any simple answers. And so this is what I think part of my passion for, in some ways, bringing those dimensions of the academic world to a church context, to say, where in church contexts do we actually take the time to read, to be informed, to process? Because what I saw, I mean, as I've led my church through different things, a few years ago, we walked through questions around women in leadership and ministry, that forcing people to say, hey, you're going to read this book, and we're going to get together once a month, and we're going to have, 2.5 hours. We're going to sit and process this. It was really fascinating because people came in, I think, much more kind of firm and hard on their stance. And once they start to get into it, they're like, okay, they still hold to a position, but I think they hold it in a different way. They hold it with a different posture, a kind of openness, a recognition of the complexity. And so that's, I mean, that's part of what I love about what we get to do with different Foundry stuff. Is part of what we're trying to do is say, we need to create these spaces as local churches, as groups of churches, where it's normal to come together and have these longer, in-depth conversations, not just, hey, we're doing 2 weeks of Sunday school on racism, and there's your answer. People are, because that's what a lot of people want is, just give me the right answer, tell me who to vote for, tell me what to think.
Right. This would be so helpful. Like I always thought, 95% of like full-time church jobs, I don't think I would fit into. The one little sliver of full-time church ministry, I'm like, I can get excited about that, is to be kind of like a I wouldn't even call myself like a
like a
director of like
residence,
cultural engagement, where I would have like, so for the next 4 Sunday evenings, we're going to spend 2 hours interacting with the race conversation. You're going to hear somebody maybe present a certain perspective. We're going to sit down on a couch, have a conversation. You're going to have a chance to ask Q&A. And then the next week, we might get somebody who's going to give a slightly different perspective, and just really model humble, thoughtful engagement rather than reaction, And again, I think the preaching of the word on Sunday is absolutely critical. I think obviously the sacraments are critical. Worship is critical. But it's hard when I look around at churches and I see those things happening, everybody's smiling, but then you go read their Facebook feeds and it's like, there's a bomb ready to go off here, Like sometimes I get worried, like sometimes I get a little worried. I'll be sitting at church and I'll look to the person next to me. I'm like, I wonder if they knew what I believed about a lot of stuff, would they be like appalled, or I'll have conversations with people and I could sense kind of their political commitments or whatever. I'm like, ooh, I hope they don't Google me, like, I don't know.
Well, and that's what's so fascinating, because it's not these, you look at the history of the Reformation and the things that divided churches, 400 years ago. And now it's not, right? It's not even, like you said, biblical or theological issues. It's these questions of socio-cultural, political issues that it feels like we just as a church have not done a good job discipling people to be firmly rooted enough in a way that can address that.
Yeah. We got to wrap things up, but what if a church, what's the next step? Somebody is listening and like, man, I would love to engage this more. What does this look like? I mean, obviously they can go to your website, which is what?
The website is thefoundrygr.org. Okay. So it's GR because we're in Grand Rapids. So that's our home base, thefoundrygr.org.
Okay.
So they can go there to see. There's places to contact us there by email. And we'd love to connect. And just if people have thoughts, ideas, we're very much on the front end of things as we're trying to engineer something that really serves the church on the ground. And so somebody hears us and says, hey, we just want to get together, talk, hang out. We're always game for that.
And anybody
I sometimes say we're an act tank. You've heard of think tanks, right? we're trying to be an act tank. Like we're not, right? We think there are plenty of articles out there about how theological education needs to change. We're trying to actually experiment and see what happens.
Okay, sweet. So they can they'll shoot you an email and they go from there. Obviously it costs money, right? I mean, they would pay you to come in and run a course or a couple courses, and all that info is on the website.
Yep. Yeah, that's all there. And again, a big part of what we try to do is, our financial model is to work with donors and churches, because we want things to be affordable for churches, for church leaders. A big part of what we do is primarily working with churches who pay as opposed to individuals who pay. Again, that's the model of education, usually all on the individual. We try to encourage churches to embrace that as part of, again, the shift that needs to happen to some extent, that's largely a church focus rather than just the individual.
That's great. I'm glad you offset the cost. I will say churches spend money on what they value,
Yep.
I just heard we had a big Greg Laurie crusade here in Boise. I didn't know that was still like a thing, but we had a big, I don't know how many thousands of people went. It's free. The event's free, but I just found out that like to put it on, it costs $1 million and churches pay half of that. So the churches in Boise paid $500,000 to bring in Greg Laurie, to share the gospel for a night. And I'm, I'm sure there's lots of value there, but that's $500,000.
Right.
That churches had that eagerly gave for that. So they saw value in it and they came up with the money. What would, if you guys had $500,000 to do theological education in a city, would you need more? Like what would, how far would that go? But if people don't see it's a need, they're not going to pay it. They're like, but we'd rather, have an event.
Right.
And hear Greg Laurie.
Well, and I think part of it too is, again, shifting our mindset to, as opposed to centralized seminaries with the bricks and mortar and pretty big infrastructures to maintain. What we're doing is a lot more cost effective, and so it does cost less. But you're right, there does have to be a value there, and I think this is not a knock on churches, but we'll sometimes go and they're like, we don't know why our leaders aren't developing. We wish we had more. And then you ask like, well, how much did you budget for that this past year? Right? And a lot of times it's
$500,
zero, right? Or $1,000. And so it's like, well, as the saying goes, your system is perfectly designed for the results you're getting. And so that's where when you think about the kind of investment that it needs, I think there is investment there, but it's much more, I think, better use of stewardship to think about maybe some different models than some others that are at play.
Yeah, you spend money on what you value. I mean, that's true of my life, your life, church's life, and everything.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, you guys, I'm super excited about this. I'm going to post links on in the show notes. People can go down and click on it. So I hope that I hope you get a lot of emails and just people that at least are like, hey, I would love to explore what this could look like. Because it's you just said something. I forgot, it was so perfectly worded that like the results of discipleship are what you invested. How did you say it? That was really a brilliantly worded way of putting it. Like,
well, was it just your system is perfectly designed to produce the results it's getting? And
yes.
So what you invest in discipleship and theological education, ministry training, you're going to see the results there based on how much you put into it.
If you're a pastor, I would imagine, if you're putting out all these fires in the church, you have to kind of go downstream and see. I was mixing metaphors, but people are drowning. Okay, you have to go downstream. Where's all the where's this coming from? And and sometimes there's so much needs in the moment that I got to marry this person, bury this person. I wish I could bury this other person, and this marriage is falling apart, and I got to make budget, and I have to so there's so much pressure of just the week to week grind of ministry that to even explore, this issue that I'm dealing with now could have been prevented if 5 years ago we had some robust discipleship happening. Because most sinful behavior is something went off the rails early on, right? In terms of discipleship.
Yeah.
So, but that's I understand that can be hard when there's so many needs in front of you, but
right. And we've set up a system where that's not part of, for the most part, that's not part of the pastor's job, or it's a small slice of it. Which again is where we come in. We're kind of like the traveling missionaries of the New Testament time. Like, you got your local people, but then you need people like Paul and others who are going to come alongside the people in those cities, reinforce, teach, equip.
Good.
In that way.
I got to bail. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate you both. Thank you for what you're doing. This is awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Preston. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thanks so much. This has been great.
Cool.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.
Hey friends, I just want to invite you to consider joining the Theology in the Raw Patreon community. This is a group of followers who believe in the ministry and work of Theology in the Raw and want to support it financially. And honestly, I've been so impacted by the people who have chosen to support this podcast. Every month they send in a bunch of questions. A lot of them are really personal, and I get to spend time responding to them in a private podcast. And we, we'll message each other throughout the month and post responses to each other's questions. I'm actually going to start something new this fall, a monthly live Zoom chat with some of the members. And I'm super looking forward to actually seeing more of their faces every month. And there's other perks to come up, like, they all get a free virtual pass to the Theology in the Raw Exiles in Babylon conference every year. But honestly, I don't want to make it sound transactional. Every single Patreon member that I've talked to says the same thing. We like all the perks. We're thankful for them, but we're just more thankful to support the ministry of Theology in the Raw, and we're glad to do so. So if this is you, if you've been impacted by Theology in the Raw, you can join the Theology in the Raw community for a minimum of $5 a month by going to patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. The link is in the show notes.